I stopped at a traffic light for an errand that would take 5 minutes, and in that pause, my life rearranged itself. It was the kind of ordinary morning that makes you think nothing will change. The sun had just started to warm the windshield, there was a radio station playing something half-remembered, and I was thinking about bread and a quick return. The light changed, the car to my left rolled forward. He was in the driver's seat. He looked up and smiled. He didn't see me. But I saw everything, a laugh I recognized, and a woman in the passenger seat holding his hand as if it had always belonged to her. The city noise blurred. For an instant I only registered sound. That low, private chuckle he had when he was amused, a sound I hadn't heard aimed at me for months. Then the image imprinted, the way her fingers curled around his, the younger tilt of her head, the ease between them. It took a full breath before I could move. The world around the intersection continued, horns, footsteps, a bus door closing, but inside me something long and fragile slid. I drove away, and my legs trembled in a way I had not let them before. I went to the bakery like I planned. I bought bread. I came home and sat in my kitchen with the bag on the table, the morning unfolding like before, and the sight of the two of them played on loop behind my eyes. That same afternoon, when I reached down to untangle my scarf, my fingers closed on something small and metallic tucked into the seam of my car seat, a tiny gold hoop. It wasn't mine. It glinted like a secret. I wrapped it in tissue and put it in a little pouch. I knew, in the raw, awful clarity of the moment, that this was not only evidence, it was proof that a private world I believed in had other inhabitants. I did not scream. I did not call anyone. I put the pouch in a drawer and made coffee. I sat at the counter and watched the sunlight cut the room into clean angles. The thing about sudden betrayals is how ordinary everything remains around them. Dishes dry on the rack, the kettle whistles, life keeps breathing. But I also knew I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen. I wanted answers. I wanted the truth, not speculation. So I began to look carefully for the small confirmations that make a suspicion into something undeniable. I want to be clear, some of the things I did later, the avenues I followed to find messages and photos, were choices I made in a state of hurt and confusion. I recognized even then that they edged into murky legal and ethical territory. I explain this not to justify, but to be honest. When you are the person who's been betrayed, the rules of what you'll risk feel different, and there's a cost to every choice. My first act was quiet and small. I started keeping a notebook again, something I hadn't done since I was a student. I wrote down dates he claimed to be at work, the odd errands he took, the times his phone would buzz and he'd slide it face down on the table. I wrote down the brand of cologne that lingered, a citrus top note I did not recognize, and the laugh, again and again, because the sound mattered. Small details felt like anchors. The gold hoop lived in a velvet pouch beside the notebook, an accusing, whispered thing. In the weeks that followed, confirmation arrived in slow, ordinary ways that together built a portrait I could no longer ignore. A photo on a Sunday morning with a coffee cup on the edge of his social feed that he claimed was a work meeting. But the cafe's interior was familiar. I had seen it in a recent carousel of images from a woman who liked his posts. A comment here, a tagged image there. Little pieces of the puzzle that, when assembled, stopped being accidental. I want to stress, I did not, at any point, broadcast accusations on social media. I tracked patterns. I saved screenshots. I wrote down times and places. For things that felt like legal boundaries, for instance, messages that were plainly not meant for me, I told myself to be careful. If I had to explain my actions, I wanted them to be defensible. That was part of my plan, to remain composed, to let facts speak, and to avoid becoming a spectacle. A week later, I stumbled onto a profile on Instagram that kept cropping up in the margins of my husband's online life. She posted photos from the same small cafes he'd begun to mention, the same routes he allegedly took to work. Her name was Bruna. She was younger. Her feed had that curated brightness so many people cultivate, but there were also candid shots, laughing with friends, a ring of light catching in her ear. I watched. I pretended not to watch. For a long time, my instinct was shame and disbelief. There are so many stories about women who see and then immediately wreck things in public, about smear campaigns and torches and nightly gossip. I did not want to be that. I wanted instead to put together a case that would be unarguable and, if it had to be, undeniable before witnesses. Above all, I wanted to preserve my dignity. The idea of stealthy, strategic clarity became my anchor. I would not explode, I would illuminate. I created a simple, anonymous account. It felt like stepping into someone else's shoes, not to deceive maliciously, but to ask questions without alerting the person whose name I used. I messaged Bruna once, shy and clumsy in the way people are over direct messages. I called myself a fan of a cafe photograph she had posted. She replied with emojis and ease, as if new followers were always just part of her day. There was nothing extraordinary at first. I kept it small and human, the way people connect online without thinking about consequences. Then, after a week of slow, gentle conversation, nothing invasive, just comments on recipes and shared complaints about slow espresso machines, I took a risk I debated over and over. I sent a photo of the gold hoop in its little velvet pouch. The message was simple. I found this and I'm trying to return it. I did not tell a story. I did not accuse. I waited. She responded quickly. There was a pause in the conversation that felt like the earth holding its breath. Then came a message. I don't think that's mine. Another pause. Can you send a picture of the inside engraving? She asked. She wanted proof. I didn't want to say too much. I sent a close-up. The light caught the brinko in a way that showed the faint varnish of wear. Her tone changed. Her words slowed. She asked if we could meet. We met in a public place, not because I wanted confrontation, but because proximity allowed me to see someone. She was smaller than I expected. She had a nervous laugh and a tiredness in her eyes that made her human instead of the caricature I had built in my head. When I showed her the pouch in person, her face folded in an expression I can't describe. Surprise, guilt, fear, relief all at once. She reached out, fingers brushing the velvet, and for a moment I saw a person who had been hiding something different from me. What followed surprised me most. Instead of outrage, she began to cry, not the melodramatic kind on cue, but a soft unraveling that made her look younger. She confessed that she had known. She said his smile was like the shadow of something she had once needed, and she had told herself it would be fleeting. She said she had never intended to hurt anyone. She said things you would expect an unfaithful woman to say, half apology, half explanation. But when she mentioned my husband's name, there was no delusion left in her voice. She had been with him. She had been with him in that cafe, and in other places she named quietly. She admitted to texts and to coffee dates, and to secrets she had promised herself would remain such. I listened. I did not yell. I did not accuse her in the way marriage dramas sometimes do. I asked questions, practical ones, not for sensation but for clarity. Did he know about me? Did he tell you he was separated? Did anyone else know? She admitted he had said things that implied more than a casual interest. She admitted she had believed him. When I asked if she would be willing to help me put the pieces together, to share what she had, to be honest in front of anyone who asked, she nodded. That was the moment a strange and powerful alliance was formed. Two women who had been kept in the dark about different things, choosing together to shine light. Bruna and I agreed only on a few things at first. We would preserve the facts, we would avoid public shaming, and we would prepare a way to make what we knew known in a controlled, dignified way. Our goal was accountability, not spectacle. We both wanted to protect ourselves from becoming caricatures in a story that could have flattened us into revenge porn or pity. We compiled what we had. For me, the notebook, the gold hoop, and a handful of suspicious timestamps mattered. For Bruna, there were screenshots she had saved of messages, grainy photos from inside a small apartment that had the same throw pillow he had once joked about in our living room. We assembled receipts and photos and dates like a meticulous historian because truth presented methodically carries a gravity that accusations do not. At times I felt the pull to expose him then and there, to let anger spill into the world so everyone could feel what I felt. But I remembered how rage can be consumed by others and used to diminish you. I wanted my response to be mine, quiet, dignified, and unmistakable. So we planned. We planned the way people plan for a meeting that will change things, with calm urgency, with attention to the order of facts, and the way those facts would land among people who had known him only as the man they celebrated. We picked a date that mattered, his 43rd birthday. It seemed cruel, perhaps, to use a celebration as the setting. But a birthday is when friends and family gather, when stories are told, when faces that have fondness for him are in one room. If the truth was going to have witnesses, this was the moment when the contrast between private deeds and public persona would be most striking. We wanted witnesses not as an act of revenge, but to protect ourselves from being rewritten by his version later. The room would be full of people whose judgments would matter not because they would gloat, but because their silence could otherwise be used to erase what had happened. There were practical things to arrange. Bruna and I curated a chronological presentation, a title in my notebook that I circled with a thick pen, The Cycle That Repeated. The title felt right because what I had discovered was not an isolated failure but a pattern. It was a sequence of choices repeated across different lives. We assembled images and dates into a slide deck, each image pinned to a simple truth: the cafe photo, a screenshot of a message she had received that suggested intimacy, a picture of the apartment with a throw pillow I recognized, the tiny gold hoop in a tiny velvet pouch. We arranged them so they told a story without editorial flourish, no mocking captions, no theatrical music. We built a timeline with the care of a lawyer and the tenderness of someone who knew it would hurt. I continued to live the public parts of my life as if I had not discovered anything wrong. I went to work. I made plans with friends. I let him think everything was the same. Inside me, there were long nights where sleep refused to come, where I lay awake listing facts like lit candles. But I also took steps to protect myself. Therapy sessions that taught me to name feelings without being consumed by them. Long walks that emptied my head of the worst rehearsal of scenes, and small rituals, making my bed in the morning as if that small act could restore order. During that time, I also found solace in certain supplements that helped me relax. I will mention one later simply as something I used to get through panicked nights, not as a cure or a promise to others. There were still ethical questions that nagged at me. In private, I asked myself, by staging a reveal in a room crowded with people, am I making a moral judgment that belongs in court, not a party? Could I have handled things differently? Those questions did not erase the pain, but they guided the way I acted. I wanted the reveal to be fact-based, not performative. I wanted to avoid humiliating people who weren't responsible for his choices. I wanted witnesses who could testify, if necessary, to the truth of what had been shown. On the night of his birthday, the house smelled of roasted chicken and lemon. Friends hugged. People brought small, ridiculous gifts and told stories about childhood embarrassments. It was normal in the way gatherings are normal, affectionate, mundane, full of small kindnesses. I arrived with a stranger's calmness. I sat near the back of the room and kept my hands still. Bruna arrived a little later, looking pale and steady. She gave me the smallest nod and took a seat close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. Daniel was there too. I noticed him as soon as I walked in. He had been quiet the last week, and there was a tension to his jaw I hadn't seen before. For reasons I'll never fully sort out, he stayed at the edge of the evening, watching in a way that suggested he knew more than he let on. When the cake was brought out, I asked for the lights to be dimmed. It felt like a ridiculous request. Who dims lights at a birthday? But it was one way to gather attention without shouting. I stood and walked to a corner where a projector had been set up. There was a silence that was not rudeness but curiosity. People love to see the final act of their friend's life play out, even if that act is a slideshow of vacation photos. I hit play. The first slide was a simple picture, the cafe photo that matched the angle and table in Bruna's older post. The room chuckled at the predictable charm of the location. The second slide was a screenshot of a message, nothing salacious, just a short exchange that implied intimacy. The third was the velvet pouch with the gold hoop, photographed by me in close-up, the light catching the worn edge. The images rolled with short, factual captions beneath them. I spoke only to read the facts, dates, places, confirmation. I refrained from commentary. I wanted the evidence to speak with the weight of witness. You could have heard a pin drop. The laughter drained from faces in a way that did not feel cruel at first. It felt like people stepping off of an escalator and realizing the floor was not where they thought. Murmurs began, the kind that reorganize a social map. Someone asked a question, and someone else answered with a name. A cousin looked toward his nephew, eyes wide. At one point I glanced toward the corner where Daniel stood. He had an envelope clutched in his hand. Bruna rose quietly and walked to him, offering the envelope. He opened it, and his face changed. A flash of disbelief, then the slow collapse of the expression he had carried all evening. Inside the envelope were pictures and notes that confirmed to him what he had suspected, or perhaps what he had feared, about the pattern repeating in his own life. His breath came in a way that made the silence heavier. The effect was not theatrical mockery. It was the raw unraveling that happens when private things become public in a way that cannot be smoothed over by smiles. My husband sat very still. For an instant I thought he might stand and protest, or laugh it off the way people sometimes do when they think a joke will save them. He did not. The room's energy shifted from sympathy to an awkward, urgent care. Friends moved to the doors. A few people left at once. Some didn't know what to say. There were no fights, no shouting, no dramatic confrontations. There was instead the kind of silence that absorbs sound. It is more devastating in many ways than anger. He looked at me then, not with the charming smile I recognized, but with an expression I now understood, a man who had been unmasked. He tried to explain, but words felt shallow in that space. He reached for my hand in a reflex I had once found comforting. I did not take it. I did not run to make a scene. Instead, I walked to my coat and put it on. I left the room with my back straight. I left because the evening had become a room of witnesses, and because I wanted to remove myself from the possibility of spectacle. I wanted to preserve the parts of me that were not meant to be performance. Outside, the air was cool and ordinary. The city carried on. I cried on the walk to my car, a soft, unmade sound that surprised me with its modesty. I slept that night like I had not in months, not because the pain vanished, but because the pattern had been named, and because naming something often loosens its hold. There is an odd kind of quiet that follows a long whisper. For the first time since the traffic light, I felt a space to breathe. The weeks after the reveal were not cinematic. They were paperwork and logistics and conversations I had avoided for months because I thought avoidance might hold the edges together. There were calls with a lawyer to ask about divorce and what would be required. There were boxes to pack, not dramatic ones thrown through windows, but slow, dignified sorting of memories into bags to be put away. I found photographs of us in a drawer and let myself examine them without the need to perform outrage for anyone. I put things in a box and labeled it Old Life. The label felt literal and also like the thin tape of someone trying to keep fragments together. Therapy became a steady light. My therapist would not give me prescriptions for courage, but she taught me how to sit with the terror and the grief without letting it decide my actions. I practiced boundaries, simple things like turning my phone off at certain hours, answering messages on my terms, and sleeping in a way that respected my body. I went walking at dawn because the city is generous in those hours, with the way light softens everything. I took vitamins and, since nights of panic still came, a supplement I had heard others mention that helped me sleep a little better. For me, it was a personal aid during a period of acute stress, not a cure. I mentioned it only because so many people ask what practical things helped when sleep went missing. And it's important to say that one woman's help is not a universal remedy. There were practical conversations to be had with people I loved. I told friends and family what had happened, not as a plea for pity, but as a request for truth to be met without erasing me. I was surprised and heartened by the quiet ways people rallied. A friend who offered to help me move a box, another who sat through a night of coffee and conversation. Solidarity turned out to be not a parade, but a handful of small acts that made the day-to-day possible. When we finally sat down to sign papers, it felt strangely formal and light. There was no dramatic fist slamming on a table, no courtroom fireworks. There were signatures, initials, and a legal vocabulary that made the separation feel like a delicate cut. I was calm. I had come through months of rawness into a place where my choices were mine to make, not a reaction to his. I walked out of that office feeling like I had reclaimed air. People sometimes ask if I regretted the way it unfolded. I think of regret often as a luxury of the uninjured, a way to wish circumstances different without having to live them. I do not regret choosing clarity over silence. I do not regret gathering the facts and presenting them to witnesses. I do not know if it could have been done less painfully or with less damage. What I do know is that living in denial felt like a slow death of self, and I refused that. In the months since, my life has rearranged itself again, this time around new routines that are quieter but steadier. I see a therapist regularly. I took a hiatus from social media for a time because the curated images of others' lives felt like salt when I was raw. I moved small things in my home to make it feel like mine again. A plant on the sill, a stack of books on a table, a mug I particularly like. I practiced saying no to invitations that felt driven by obligation rather than desire. I learned how to spend a Saturday afternoon alone without it turning into a test of endurance. Bruna and I keep in touch, not as friends in the way we might have been before, but as two people who collaborated in that particular moment. She is rebuilding her life too, and that knowledge, that the woman who had once been the other woman is now someone who would stand beside me in a living room full of witnesses, surprised me with its complexity. There is no neat moral here where enemies become allies easily. Instead, there is the messy human truth that people who hurt can also help to reveal truths, and that solidarity doesn't always fit tidy boxes. If there is a final thing I want to say, it is this. Dignity is not silence. Dignity is not spectacle. It is the choice, often daily and often quiet, to act in a way that preserves your sense of self. It is the difference between exploding in public for the brief comfort of being seen and standing in a room with witnesses and letting facts carry the weight of what must be known. When betrayal arrives, it will ask you to become someone you are not. You get to decide who you will be in answering. There are 2 short practical notes I want to leave you with. 1. If you find yourself in a situation like this, consider safety and legality before you act. Some choices can have consequences beyond the immediate heartbreak. Ask for help. Speak with trusted friends or professionals. 2. Find one thing, even a small ritual that anchors you. For me it was therapy sessions and morning walks. For others it might be journaling, speaking with a counselor, or reaching out to a support group. If you need resources, look for licensed counselors and local support networks. I will leave links in the description for organizations that helped me and for directories to find a therapist near you. If this story resonates with you, if you know someone who needs to hear that dignity and strategy can coexist, please share this video. Real stories like these matter because they remind us we are not alone in the painful, complicated work of reclaiming our lives. I still remember the traffic light. That ordinary pause that made a hidden life visible. For a long time I feared that moment would haunt me forever. Instead, it taught me that clarity can come when we least expect it, and that once you have the facts, you can choose, deliberately, calmly, with your own dignity intact, what to do next.